Welcome to the Histories of Northamptonshire podcast series, and this episode number 24. Recorded on location, each episode tells the story of one of the many and varied objects which are the focus of the exhibition A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects. The exhibition runs at the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery between the 20th of September 2025 and February 2026. Selected by local individuals, heritage groups and the museum's own curators, each object tells a different story from the county's past. And so, to our guest for this episode.
I'm Peter Walker and I'm chair of Brigstock Archaeological Group, which is a community group, which is where this object was found.
Brigstock is associated with equestrianism and has been for many, many years. We have an equestrian connection to this object. What is the object?
So the object is a Romano-British copper alloy bronze horse and rider pair.
Why is that significant?
It's significant within the village, as you rightly pointed out. We still have the hunt rides out on Boxing Day there. It's a very horsey village. So lots of horses are kept there. You regularly see horses being taken up and down. There are people learning to ride, and one of the menages there. So it's very relatable. That's
the 21st century. We are going back quite a number of centuries to the age when this particular item was, cast, worked, carved. How was it produced?
It would have been cast. I believe this one is solid. I've got to be honest on this one. I'm not 100% sure whether it was the lost wax method or whatever it was, but quite a degree of skill required for it. But in terms of the sort of aesthetics of it, it does not look anywhere near as refined as some of the other works, even within this country, copper alloy works that you can find.
Relatively speaking, quite a rough piece, but nevertheless decorative. What function would this item have had?
So it's generally interpreted as being a votive object, so possibly ex voto, so in sort of fulfilment of a promise, if you want. And given the find site, and there being a number of these objects, it seems to be a practice, we're not entirely clear, but a practice associated possibly with a horse cult that may or may not be more distinct in certain parts of this country. It certainly was evident in other parts of the Roman Empire.
So are we talking about something that the local community would have used to worship? Is that what you're aiming at?
It's hard to say whether you can say it's the local community. I think if you imagine that the Romano-British community was a homogenous community, it never was.
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
That you had different people with different identities within the Roman Empire. Some of them perhaps may have been soldiers that came from overseas, and they were stationed here. Some of them may be descendants of these veterans who were allotted land and settled here. Other people were descendants from the Iron Age communities, the indigenous Iron Age communities that were already here. And the way they interacted with Roman culture would have varied enormously from region to region and from different, I'm going to say statuses. So, people that were perhaps more closely engaged with the whole imperial project may have seen themselves more as perhaps we traditionally imagine Roman people to have perceived themselves.
So when we come back to the object in question, you've mentioned that it's quite rough in the way that it has been made. We often think of the Romans as being sophisticated, civilized as a community. So does this tend to lead one to think that this isn't something that was made by the Romans? It might have been made from somebody from within the Iron Age community, the indigenous community, because I understand it was found close to not one but two shrines that were also excavated in the area.
That is true. One of those shrines overlaid an earlier penannular ditch, which it has been suggested might have been perhaps some sort of an Iron Age shrine site as well. That's open to, very much open to interpretation, really. Again, I suppose really I wouldn't necessarily make that distinction as clearly made by indigenous people versus clearly people that identify themselves as sort of Romans in perhaps the more traditional sense. I think what might explain this a little bit better, there's a really interesting paper by a British archaeologist called Joan Webster, and she rejected this idea largely, not entirely, of Romanisation, that the indigenous people soaked up sort of Roman material culture like this, and instead talked about this concept of creolization. Creolization is a blend of different cultures. It's not all being imposed top down. The local indigenous people also, to an extent, even enslaved people, didn't have to fully adopt it or adapt it. So it was kind of more empowering, if you want, and enabled us to better explain the differences in patterning of material culture.
What then does this object tell us about Northamptonshire in that era, with the aspect of invasion and a new style of culture, a new style of community coming forward, which then produces items like this?
Well, certainly it was I'm not going to say it's not a new form entirely. I mean, metalwork, Iron Age it's called the Iron Age because they were making metalwork. But this kind of representation of this particular one being interpreted as some sort of a war god, the plumed helmet, traditionally like perhaps Mars. I think some of the early interpretations of this were that it might be a British variation of that. And it certainly tells us that there was integration at some levels, and certainly within the community up where we live, and that some of those identities that were perhaps associated, with that might be what we think of as more traditionally Roman, so bronze statues and so forth. But that doesn't mean that everybody saw that in the same way, and that everybody indeed would have given a votive offering like that at that shrine.
And the significance of having a horse within this particular piece?
It's a sort of martial component, is it? So it's a military type component. And what you don't see on that and what's assumed to go with it, and the other figurines that have been found, is that they're perhaps carrying a spear and shields. There are other sites with other evidence to suggest that as well. The horse then would have been sort of part of that overall ensemble. I mean, you could perhaps have imagined that it might have been perhaps a retiring British auxiliary in the Roman army who had maybe made some sort of a pledge that if I get through my stint with the Roman army, I'll give some sort of an offering. You certainly get something very similar with sort of trading merchants where they actually have whole altars with inscriptions on it. The problem with a lot of this stuff is there really is very little in the way of written evidence actually attached to the object to say this is who it is. So we have to put our interpretation on it.
There are other items from Brigstock which are part of this particular exhibition. What does this item say about Brigstock and that part of Northamptonshire?
It seems very rural now, but just to the northwest of us, there was a villa excavated, which I believe I'm right in saying has the only piece of sculpted marble in the county. Interestingly, it's a very finely sculpted marble bottom. That's all that there is of it at the moment. And then a very well published recently, just a little further north up at Weldon, another villa site with a shrine that was associated with a mausoleum that was then converted into a tilery. Over at Oundle and over at Ashton, there's been quite a lot of Roman fights. So it's actually quite a complex Roman landscape. I'm not saying it's not rural, but we don't really fully understand the settlement patterning there.
And from your point of view as an archaeologist, what reaction do you have to this particular item? It's not very big. It poses as many questions as it answers. But what's your feeling about this?
For me, when I see something like this, it's lovely to see a bit of metalwork that's in relatively good nick, because so much of the stuff that we find, you're finding bits and pieces of things, and this is clearly identifiable what it is. And then when you find a number of them, you're looking at repeated behaviours. And then when you start seeing repeated behaviours, you start thinking, what does it mean? Now, we live in a village that has a Saxon tower that has a fairly dwindling congregation at the moment, but there is a sort of continuity there. For the Saxons, there was Norman stuff added to it and all the way through the Victorian period, so there's a continuity there. What we're looking at the Roman shrine is what happens when a religion ends visibly, materially. We can't see the evidence for it. And in a way, I sort of imagine it might be a little bit like what would happen, if no one looked after our churches for millennia. You would find bits and pieces and you would go, well, what did that mean? And why was it important to them? And that's how I feel about it.
It would be interesting to see what in 2,000 years archaeologists would make of our churches and the items that are inside them. Nevertheless, we're able to turn back the clock perhaps that far with this particular item. Peter, it's been lovely to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this Histories of Northamptonshire podcast. If you would like to find out more about the objects or listen to other episodes in the series, go to www.northamptonmuseums.com. Alternatively, you can visit the Northampton Museum and Art Gallery, where you can see the A History of Northamptonshire in 100 Objects exhibition for yourself. The Histories of Northamptonshire project is funded by Arts Council England as part of the National Portfolio Programme.